All right. Do you see me but bigger now? Didn't this work?
I see you bigger. Yeah.
Okay, good. So now I can switch over to here,
Oh,
but also
wow.
put myself on the screen. It's all fancy. All right. So here's the deal. I don't mind if people interrupt me while I'm talking. I've been working all day. I'm tired. I'm used to interactive talks. I'm still not. I've given a couple online talks, and it's still eerily silent. I mean, if people are snoring or booing or laughing and they're muted, it's tough to pick up on that. So, yeah, if anybody wants to interrupt me, I mean, be polite about it, but I'm okay answering questions in the middle of my talk. And I am just talking about SSH, which seems pretty basic for a Linux talk, right? I mean, everybody who is familiar with Linux is probably familiar with SSH, but it's the kind of thing that is so incredibly useful that I do think of it as the Swiss Army knife of the command line. Of all the command line tools out there, SSH and probably grep are the ones that I use most often on a day-to-day basis. And so I wanted to talk about not just what SSH is, but some of the cool things you can do with it. Some of the cool things you can do with it that are kind of pointless these days, but are still, cool to talk about, I guess. And I'm not planning to give any demonstrations. Like I'm not going to try to share a terminal window and SSH right now. I want to talk about concepts and I want to talk about what's actually happening. Partially because every time I do a live demo, it usually goes poorly. But more than that, I was a trainer for CBT Nuggets, like I said, for like 10 years. And now I'm doing the same sort of training that I did when I worked for a company, but I'm giving it all away on YouTube. And so a lot of what I'm talking about is actually in an SSH course that I have on my YouTube channel for free. And I go into the specifics about how to do stuff there, and I have the luxury of post editing when I do things on YouTube. So if things go wrong, I don't have to post them, and so everything on YouTube goes so smooth. Anyway, so I encourage you to go there. I'll have links at the end if you want to actually find this stuff. But SSH is like I said, one of those things that's super cool, like heat pumps and Kool-Aid. And I probably use it more often than I should, not because it's always the best tool, but because it's the most convenient tool. It's always just right there on every computer that I'm at. And one of the first things that people ask me, or that I talk about with SSH is, see, I'm on the wrong screen here. Here we go and get fancy. Isn't SSH this just like Telnet? Why don't I just use Telnet? And yes, it sort of takes the place of what Telnet was, but there's more to it than just that. Telnet and SSH are both a way to connect to a remote Linux or any system, but for the case of today, we're going to talk about Linux. It's a great way to connect, and Telnet used to be the way to do that. And it's not really much of an issue to talk about anymore, except that I had a coworker back when I worked at the school district in Indian River, which is one of the directions from me now. I live in Petoskey now, but while I was there, one of my coworkers that worked at the ISD, who is probably one of the three most brilliant Unix/Linux people I know, and I'm not one of those top three, by the way. He used Telnet, and it drove me nuts because I'm like, Telnet doesn't encrypt traffic, and like your authentication is in plain text, and what are you doing? And then he assured me that Telnet is now secure. And so he never felt a need to switch to SSH because he used Telnet that was secure and it didn't use plain text passwords for authentication. And I don't know, he also was a FreeBSD guy, so maybe there's something there, and maybe it is secure. Maybe it is, but it's kind of like, sure, even if it is secure and it's like it's still like a sharpened stick compared to SSH, and it's all of the things that you can do. I mean, yeah, maybe it's a sharpened stick with a hilt now so that it's secure. I don't know, but it still only connects to a remote computer at any port, and you just like talk. But SSH, that's like the most basic thing it does is connect to a remote computer. And if all you need to do is connect to a remote computer, I still recommend you use SSH. Does anybody know if is Telnet actually secure these days? I honestly haven't used it in so long. I don't know. So go ahead and put it in the chat if you actually know if Telnet is secure these days. Because really, the guy I'm talking about, I won't say his name, but he actually got hired by AWS, and I had to get interviewed by the FBI so that he could get like proper clearance. I mean, he's really a smart dude, and he still used Telnet last time I talked to him. So anyway, oh, really quickly too, this is actually my Swiss Army knife that I use every day. And the reason that that's important is, did you know that Swiss Army knives can come with a Phillips screwdriver instead of a corkscrew? And I mean, I don't have anything against wine, but I find that I have a need for a Phillips screwdriver far more often than I have need of a corkscrew. So anyway, that's my little plug for.
Is that also your sharpened stick?
It is not my sharpened stick, no, but it is my hilt. I did, that's a custom hilt that I put on there. So, yeah, anyway, that's, you can use Telnet, but if you want to use Telnet, that's maybe next month's talk. I don't know. The one thing though, that Telnet is good for, and let me get rid of my face because I don't want to block it. If you Telnet to towel.blinkenlights.nl, you can see Star Wars: A New Hope in all of its ASCII glory. And I actually tried to connect earlier today and I couldn't, which really made me sad. But I guess it goes on and off, and sometimes it's online, sometimes it's offline. But here's a cool little secret that I didn't know until today when I was trying to connect. If you connect via IPv6, apparently you get extra scenes and color. So I'm going to keep trying to see if I can get in, because I mean, that's just pretty cool. Anyway, so yeah, SSH is what we want to do, even though Telnet can do this. I've never seen anything like this in SSH, but this is an animated GIF, and it works fine. So yeah, fine, Shawn. Okay, SSH rules or whatever. That's fine. Great. How do you use it? Well, this is pretty basic. I'm guessing most people here know this, but I don't want to assume anything, especially if people are watching this after the fact. So when you are SSHing, well, if I put my face back here, I like to be able to look at the camera when I'm talking. So, if you SSH to a server, you just type SSH space and then like the server IP or the server domain or whatever it is on your network. It will log you in using, and this is what I did here. It uses, no, that's not what it uses. I don't know what happened there. It uses your username on your current computer. So if you don't specify a username, it will just SSH using your username. And the becomes a problem if you, for some reason, wanted to sudo SSH, because then it will connect as the root user, which is almost never what you want to do. And so if you are connecting to a server that is not a server that has you as the same username that your local computer is using, you just do this. You just specify the username at, and then the server IP address or the domain, and it will use that to log in. And so once you connect, it will prompt you for your password by default. So it's not the password on your local computer. And that is an issue that we're going to talk about kind of in depth for over the next 6 hours. I don't know how long it's going to take, but we'll talk about it in length. But it's important to note that when you connect to a remote server via SSH, it's going to prompt you for the password on that remote server. I mean, that should make sense. You're connecting with your username, but the password is the password on that system. And that's not always great, right? I mean, it makes sense. It's the simplest way to do it. Let me get rid of my face again. I should have looked at where my face was going to sit. And there's really nothing wrong with passwords. So yeah, to be clear, passwords are okay. However, if you are logging into servers that are publicly accessible, for example, they can be brute force attacked. If your username is known, you can just like keep hammering it, trying to log in. And yes, there's things like fail to ban, which is software that will stop people from hammering your server. But it's not great to have an exposed computer that you're logging in with a password. Another problem is that the passwords are maintained on the remote server. And if you manage the remote server, hey, that's awesome. You can manage the password there too, but it's still kind of a pain in the butt. So Oh, the other thing is that it makes automation really, really icky. If you are trying to connect to a remote computer and you're using something like Ansible, if you don't know Ansible, it's a DevOps tool that uses SSH to manage things. It just makes it really icky if you log in with a password. And so, yes, there must be a better way. And yes, there is a better way. And if you're wondering, yes, this picture is actually one of the ones from the James Webb Telescope that was released today. It is just so cool that I think we maybe should just spend the next 20 minutes staring at it in all of its glory and talking about what it means for humanity, et cetera, et cetera. But anyway, I just saw a comment. I'd like to know what happens. I'm doing the, this is just OBS, just open source, obsproject.com, I think.
Technical difficulties.
It's bound to happen.
Okay, that's not good. I wonder if the connection got dropped.
I hope he knows.
Yeah, the connection got lost, it looks like.
Yeah.
Well, the guy who's telling us how to connect the stuff isn't connecting.
All right, come back to us, Shawn. Come back.
He's probably talking away.
Probably. This is our lot in life.
I don't have a phone number for him. But
OBS crashed his system. That's what happened. It has a tendency to do that.
Yeah.
Let's see.
Might be time to use the regular old-fashioned phone.
Yeah, well, it doesn't really work very well for slides, unfortunately, unless you can figure out how to shove them over AT&T.
Yes.
Well, at least a phone call to him would let him know that there's a problem.
If we had that,
unfortunately,
yes.
Yeah.
Am I back?
We have email. Yeah, you're back, I think.
It was weird. I could hear everything everybody was saying, and I could see myself on the screen. That was so bizarre.
It's showing that your connection was lost for whatever reason.
Well, welcome back.
Yeah.
Thanks. And now it won't let me turn on my video. Oh, this is.
You know what? Let me kick other you and see what that hat does.
Yeah, kick other him.
Okay, other you is gone.
Okay, and you can hear me okay?
You're fine.
But am I presenting? Doesn't think I'm presenting. Oh, that's the chat. Well, you guys just missed the best part of the presentation. It's
of
so
course,
impressive.
yeah.
Oh,
Hey,
man.
We had somebody
class.
give a talk. They talked for an hour, not knowing
yes.
that they had disconnected.
Oh, no.
He gave his
Yeah.
entire presentation.
It was Michael Lucas that he was such a champ that he actually regave his entire presentation.
He did it a second
We
time
won't
for us.
expect that from you though.
Well, no, I mean, by all means, if it happens, it happens. I'll record it and post it on YouTube and make you watch it there. Now, okay, can you see me again now? Is my
You're fine
fancy
now.
little-
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
All right. I don't know what went on. Where was I? So, yes, there is a better way. James Webb Telescope, all of those things that I was talking about, maybe you heard, maybe you didn't hear. But the whole idea of logging in without a password is not new, right? I mean, we do that with our phones, like Touch ID, Face ID, retinal scans on Star Trek, whatever the case may be. The idea of not using a password is not new. But with SSH, what we use is key pairs, right? We use a public-private key pair. Oh, dang it. I got like 7 screens here. All right, let me get rid of my face. I feel like I should keep checking in. Like, am I still here?
Yep. Still here.
Okay, good. So anyway, how a public-private key pair works, and this is not a perfect metaphor. A private and public key pair work kind of like you have a private key, which is it's just a file with text in it. But this is something that you never, ever share. I'm going to actually move my face here because, again, I like to look at the thing when I'm talking. So the private key is something that you keep, guess what? Private, right? You never, ever let that private key out of your ideally out of your house. In fact, I'm going to talk a little bit later about why you should be careful about what you store, like on a device that you take around with you, like a laptop too. But this private key allows you to prove you are who you are, because you're the only person who can unlock the public key, which is what you give away. So everybody in the world, you want to have access to your public key. And then all they have to do is put that public key on the remote server. You don't even need to know what the password is. As long as you have the private key, you can log in. That it counts that as authentication, even if it doesn't match your password, which is just really, really super cool. Now, like I said, it's not really a perfect metaphor. It's not just like a key. There's actually, it's a cryptographic signing, handshake things that actually goes back and forth. But basically, the only way that you can, or the only person who can authenticate to this public key is somebody with this private key. And so as long as you have that private key, anybody who puts this public key in a place that allows authentication will let you in. And so that's great, except, well, what if you lose the key, right? I mean, that's not ideal, especially not just like, oh, I lost my key, I can't get in, but what if you lose your key and somebody else finds your key, and then all of a sudden they have the key to whatever server that might be? Well, that's not great, right? I mean, we don't have to know of a password that is like maintained on that other server, but now all of a sudden, all of our eggs are in this one private key file, and that's a scary place to be. Now, again, that yikes. However, there's more that we can do. We can put a passphrase on this private key. Still don't ever share it, okay? It's like a private key with a passphrase is not something that you just want to share with everybody. There's no reason to ever share a private key, and a passphrase adds, it's like a password, but it's called a passphrase just to differentiate a little bit. But basically, it encrypts the private key so that it's not usable unless you type the password to open up the private key, and then you can use that to authenticate. And so when you create the key pair, you have the option of adding a passphrase or not adding a passphrase. And it's always, always, always the best security practice to add a passphrase. But there's always a but, right? There are times where, I mean, I've been a Linux sysadmin for more than 20 years. There are still times, I will freely admit, that on an internal network, I will occasionally create a key pair that does not have a passphrase so that I can automatically do some things internally. But it's a kind of a rare occurrence, and it's like a one use case key pair. Like, it's not something like, oh, this is my key pair that I keep without a passphrase and I use it for all the things that I want to get into without typing a passphrase. Well, no, don't be that guy, because that's just incredibly insecure. But I don't want to pretend that nobody who does this for a living ever uses a passphrase-less key pair, because there are times, like if I want to run a cron job on a local computer, that I'll just like, you know what, it's going to be such a pain to do it any other way. So I will set something up like that. But this is another big but. If you do something like that for some weird niche case, never do it on a laptop, okay? Don't ever put a private key on a laptop without a passphrase, because if you lose that, it's just so bad. In fact, I have to admit, I've never had a laptop stolen, knock on wood, but I have had, I have misplaced a laptop for like months. It was a MacBook, 12-inch MacBook, really super thin. Really, it was next to my bed that I like used to send email at night when I couldn't sleep or whatever. And it actually just slipped under my bed, and I couldn't find it for like 2 months. And even though all of the SSH key pairs that were stored on my laptop had passphrases, I have to admit, I still kind of panicked. It was still a really icky feeling. And there were a couple remote servers that I actually removed the keys from just because it just creeped me out. So yeah, be really careful with your private keys. They're just like your keys, right? I mean, they're important to keep track of. We'll talk a little bit about how to keep track of them. And I expect that other people will have some better ideas about keeping track of lots of key pairs. That's not something that I have to deal with a whole lot. I have a very small team that I work with, and I don't have to manage a bunch of key pairs. But okay, so you're like, okay, great, Shawn. So we don't have to type in a password to get on the remote server. Now all we have to do is type in a passphrase to get into the remote server. Well, I mean, yeah, and oh, I put my face on this poor guy. Yeah, that's a little bit frustrating. Like, what the heck? What's the point? Why don't we just use passwords? Well, there are still advantages because the password is not maintained on the remote server, right? I mean, so that's an advantage. And there are other things that we can do so that we don't have to constantly type in the passphrase every time we want to authenticate with a key pair. And so if this seems like we're back to square one, how is this different from using a password? Well, I mean, the passphrase is local on your private key, but there's more we can do as well. And that's where SSH agent comes in. Now, SSH agent, first of all, it's not a panacea. This is not a solution to all of the problems that we have. It's really awesome, and it makes dealing with key pairs a lot easier, but there are still some issues that we deal with. I'm going to put my face on here with Agent Smith. I'll be his right-hand man would be here. So I'm Agent Smith's right-hand man. Wait, that makes me a bad guy. All right, I'm not his right-hand man anymore. So the thing about SSH agent is it runs on your computer and it keeps your decrypted, so already passphrase entered private key in memory. And that means that you use SSH agent, and this is actually in my YouTube course tutorial video stuff, how to do all this, like the actual commands that you use and the environment variables and how to send them so that they're there automatically. But once it's in memory, you can use it from your session without retyping that passphrase. So it's basically like you type the passphrase and it remembers, and it like keeps it open, like unencrypted, so that you can continually use that passphrased key but still connect without having to type in the passphrase every time. Now, SSH agent is great. I'll admit it can be kind of a pain in the butt, though. You have to watch the video for like specifics, but it sets environment variables. You have to start it and then enter your key phrase. There are ways you can have it launch on when you log in. I am creeped out by that because I don't want things to be automatically loaded and decrypted. That's just a personal preference of mine. I generally do it manually, so it is a little bit of a pain in the butt. And if you don't clean up after yourself, like when you're done with your session and you want to log out, if you don't clean up the processes, the SSH agent processes that are running and the environment variables are set and stuff, you can have like multiple copies of it running, and like you can't access it anymore, but it's still running. It's kind of messy. It's not perfect. But it makes it possible to have more secure, passphrase protected keys and still be able to do things like run scripts. Now, and this is this is how I actually recommend. Like I taught a course on how to use Ansible, and this is the method that I highly recommend you use if you're going to run something like Ansible. Ansible, like I said, is a DevOps tool that it actually sends similar commands. It like brings remote computers up to a state that you set. I know this is not an Ansible session, but basically it connects to all the remote computers via SSH. And so on your computer, if you set up SSH keys for all of those computers, that's great. That's ideal. And then just initiate SSH agent so that when Ansible tries to run stuff, you don't have to type the passphrase 800 times, because Ansible actually won't even prompt you. It'll just error out and say it can't connect. So that's a way that you can run tools that depend on like sort of passwordless entry into remote servers, because as far as Ansible is concerned, it's just like a private key without a passphrase on it. So agent is awesome, but yeah, it can be kind of a pain in the butt. And so, the wrong window again. And so, does that mean that we just make one key to rule them all? And of course, the answer is no. And the reason that it's no is because, well, first of all, if your key doesn't have a passphrase, that is not your quote unquote key that you use anywhere except very specific purposes. Another thing is, so there's been conversation and debate about the most secure way to do SSH keys, so to speak. Should you have one key pair for every server that you connect to? Some people say yes, because it gives you a diversity. If one is compromised or something goes wrong, it can't affect another one. But if all of your SSH keys are stored in the same place and you use the same passphrase on them, you don't get a whole lot of benefit from having multiple keys going to every server. And so, oh, that's an old message. I thought did my computer crash again? No. Okay. So yeah, you don't have the advantage of separating all these keys if they all have the same passphrase. Also, this one is important. So GitHub, if anybody is a developer, or actually most people have a GitHub account these days, whether you're a developer or not. I have a GitHub account with repos, and I'm not a developer. I would never get a job as a developer. I guess that's a better way to put it. But when you put your public key on GitHub, that is tied to your user ID. And so if you use that same public private key pair for other things, it's possible for somebody to figure out who you are connecting to a server if you give them your public key and it's the same public key on GitHub. So, I mean, it's possible that your identity, like who you are, could be compromised that way. So that's something to keep in mind. Let's see, what are some other reasons that you don't want to use just one key? I guess that's it, just for security. Now, I'll be honest, again, I'm trying to keep it real, and there's the perfect way to do it, and then there's the way that usually it gets done. I will generally use the same SSH key pair if I'm connecting to like several servers in a single data center. Just things that logically to me, like, if I'm not really increasing the security by adding more complexity to my life, I will often go as secure as makes sense to me. And so, like, if I'm connecting to one data center and there's multiple servers in there, I'll usually use the same SSH key pair to connect to that particular data center. Again, it's fine if you use multiples, but that's just one of my personal things. I'll be curious, either in the chat or questions at the end, some other rationale that people have for using lots and lots of SSH keys. I tend to not like tons because complexity, but there are reasons that I wouldn't use the same key that I use on GitHub somewhere else, just because that creeps me out. Not that I really connect to places that I wouldn't want people to know who I am. I don't know. The privacy bone or the privacy hairs on the back of my neck stand up when that happens. So anyway, the big question now that you understand key pairs, and if you want to actually create them and use SSH agent, again, watch the video on YouTube where I'm not stumbling doing live demos that fail. But a good question is, so what makes this better than Telnet, right? I mean, everything you've described, I guess, makes it more secure to authenticate, but this doesn't seem cool. This is not Swiss Army knife. This is a sharp stick with modules. I guess, I don't know, my metaphors aren't great today, but this is better because that's just the very basic. Remember at the beginning I said the very basic thing that you do with SSH is connect to other servers. There are other things that you can do. They're all cool. Some of them are more useful than others. And so we'll start with this was always the demonstration. Let me move my head, because I want everybody to see the glory that is Window Maker. How many? I'm curious if anybody used Window Maker in their olden days of using. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
All right. Good. And then did you switch to Afterstep eventually because you thought it might be better, and it was not any better? It was just basically the same.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
WM and all those.
Oh yeah. Exactly. So
things.
So the traditional super cool trick that, I mean, I'm dating myself, I know, but the gray hair dates me anyway. When you used to go to Linux conferences and you would see somebody demonstrating something cool, it was almost always opening a remote GUI application over SSH by redirecting X11, the window manager, to your local computer, and you could actually run a remote thing from the computer over here.
Can we have true confessions time?
Yes.
I still do this.
The demo?
The SSH dash capital X to get a remote session. I still do this.
Like as a practical, like daily thing to actually do stuff. That's awesome. Yes. Actually, that was one of my questions I wanted to ask people, because I mean, the whole point is, it's actually running over here, but the window is on your local computer. And I honestly don't even know if this works like with Wayland. You might know that. Does it work with Wayland?
I don't know. I'm still on Ubuntu 18.04 because I live in the past.
Okay. I largely live in the past too, as you can tell by my window maker references. So I actually did that. I haven't done this in years, like in a real world scenario. When I worked at the school district, I did. I had my desk in my office, and there were Linux computers that were running on the server rack. And there were a couple, I don't remember. I tried really hard earlier today when I was making this slide to remember what application it was. And I think it was something to do with Linux terminal server. So we're coming full circle. That was the last time I spoke at Mug, was about Linux terminal server. I think it was something about controlling student desktops or something. But anyway, I would run it remotely on my local computer. But I haven't done that practically for a long time. And I was curious if anybody else did, because for me, it's been a neat party trick, just showing people how flexible Linux can be. But basically, yes, SSH dash capital X, and you can, as long as it's enabled, I think it has to be enabled on the server. Again, it's been a long time, but it allows you to, and how you do it, you SSH in, right, with that flagged command flag with dash capital X. And then you type on the command line that you're SSH'd into a GUI app. Normally, if you do that over SSH, it's like, can't connect to display 0. But if you're SSH'd in with that capital X flag, it will all of a sudden, depending on how fast you're connected to that remote computer, bring up the app on your local desktop. It's so cool. And I am so going to Google after this meeting whether or not it works on Wayland, because
I think there's an X Wayland X that runs in Wayland, and that's how it works. I mean, it's like running X on a Mac.
Right.
You can do that, or X on Windows. You can do that.
Yeah, on a Mac, I don't know if it's possible anymore. I think they broke that in one of the most recent versions. Yeah. Because truth be told, so this is back when I would do this at the school. It was a Macintosh school when I got there. I changed that pretty quick. It was a Macintosh school, so I had a Mac with like one of the first versions of OS 10, and that is the computer that I would remotely SSH in one of the apps. So anyway, I don't use it much. It actually brings me a little bit of joy that you still use this. Was that Jim? Was I talking to Jim?
No, this is Craig. And I actually use it for a GUI mail. So if I'm in Muck or something like that as my usual daily driver, and I need to get a link because someone managed to not put a link, or it's one of those links that goes about 10 pages long, I'll use that to right click on the link in either Evolution or Thunderbird, whichever one's behaving better.
Fascinating.
On my system. Yeah.
I have to admit, I've become a webmail guy. Rainloop is my current server of choice. I started hosting my own email recently because Google got stupid about their Google hosted domain, like G Suite stuff. Yeah. And wow, has that been a blast from the past? But that's, again, sorry, we're talking about SSH today. So anyway, yes, this is cool. I'm so glad that somebody actually still does it. But one of the things that is, let me move my face again. One of the things that is still very useful, but fell off the screen. I don't know why it fell off the screen there. Anyway, this is a shameless plug for the Awesome Socks Club. This is just Hank and John Green have this club, and all the proceeds go to charity for maternal ward in Sierra Leone. So that's my plug for the day, that I'm not affiliated with it all, but it's pretty cool. But you can set up a socks proxy, And socks does not mean like socks. It
Socks.
actually,
Yeah.
What's that?
Socks. I remember that. That's another blast from the past.
Yeah, right. So this is something I actually do occasionally use. So another thing that you can do with SSH is you can connect to a remote computer with it's actually -D flag. And this is in my YouTube SSH videos as well. But you can connect to it with that flag, and then your local computer will be a SOCKS 5 proxy. And so you can connect your browser to localhost, and you'll see, where'd my pen go? Here's my pen. That you can actually, connect to localhost on whatever port you specify. I think 1080 is the default, but you actually have to specify it. So I guess it's just industry standard, not really default. But anyway, when you do that, if you connect to localhost, it will tunnel all of your web traffic through the SSH server. And this, I actually use this because if I'm too lazy to type out a big long SSH tunnel that we're going to cover, in a couple more slides, that's like the crux of the whole thing here tonight. But it allows you to connect to a web interface of a server that's like on a remote network. Like, let's say I'm connecting to a remote computer that's on its own LAN, and I want to connect to a web interface on that LAN. Well, if I set up a SOCKS proxy for my browser, all of a sudden, everything inside that remote computer's LAN is accessible to me. And all I have to do is just type in the IP address, and it'll send it through the SOCKS proxy. And it's really cool. Yeah, that's the only useful thing that I actually find it is. I guess you can change your source IP if you need to change your source IP. It's not really great for a ton of things. Like I said, it's just not great. And it's sucky because it's a pain in the butt to change your browser config. And yes, there are plugins for, what are they called? Extensions, like for most browsers, where you can quickly switch proxy settings. And so maybe that would be a great way to do it. But it's a pain to switch. It only affects the browser. And this is really, really important because that means that it's leaky. And by leaky, I mean that the only traffic that's going through here is web traffic. So if there's like another app on your system that is, going out to the internet, like a chat app or any app that's on your system that isn't set up to use a proxy, it's just going to use whatever local connection you have. So do not think of this as a replacement for VPN, because it is not. It's just leaky. And it looks like, so let me get some of this. I kind of messed up my screen. It looks like down here there are some options like to send your DNS through the SOCKS proxy, and I don't know what enable DNS over HTTPS even means. This isn't something I use often enough to really try and figure out the nitty-gritty details because I don't trust it. Right? It's the browser. You could set environment variables up so that everything on your system that listens to environment variables will use the proxy. But it's not ideal, right? It's great for a quick hack. Like I said, this is what I use it for if I want to connect to a web interface without manually forwarding ports. But this is kind of just another party trick as well. It's neat and it's cool and it works shockingly well, but it just doesn't have all that many use cases. Now, if you do want to use SSH for this kind of a thing, but for your whole computer, there is another way. And this is not really SSH. Here, I'm trying to put my face here so you can see my guilty stare. This is not really SSH. This is a program that uses SSH. It's called Shuttle, but it's spelled SSH. It's like a play on words. Very clever, right? Very, very cool. Shuttle is a program that I used to use quite extensively because it doesn't just set up tunnels. It actually sets up your routing table so that it routes traffic through the SSH connection that it sets up in the background. And somehow, I honestly do not understand how it does this. It doesn't do TCP over TCP. And I'll talk just briefly about that when we talk about tunneling. But when you set up an SSH tunnel to magically do traffic through the tunnel from one network to another, it unfortunately does this thing called TCP over TCP, and it makes things really slow. It still works, and I use SSH tunnels a lot, and they're just powerful and awesome. But it makes things slow because it sort of kind of breaks TCP, and TCP has to like retransmit stuff, and that's a deeper network conversation. But somehow shuttle just magically makes everything work, and it just does. It's like a tiny little ad hoc VPN that all you need is an SSH connection to a remote server, and it will allow you to route your traffic through that server remotely, which is so cool. Unfortunately, I actually hadn't used it in years, but I did fire it up and install it for the course that I keep talking about. And it's a little bit finicky. Half the time it won't start right. It errors out, and you just like restart it over and over, and one time it works. I haven't figured out exactly why. So I guess this is now relegated down to the like cool party trick thing. But man, is it a cool party trick, because it really is like a full-blown router. It does not route UDP traffic. I guess I should say that. But it's like a full-blown router to wherever you have SSH access to. It's just so stinking cool. So yeah, Shuttle, SSHUTTLE, is a neat program that you should totally check out. Nowadays, if I have to do something like this, I would probably just recommend using a real VPN. The real VPN I would recommend you use at this point is WireGuard. I'm a huge WireGuard fan. Maybe we'll talk more about WireGuard. WireGuard is kind of like the SSH of the VPN world, which is a weird thing to say. So anyway, yeah, that's a whole nother talk too. And you've probably heard tons about WireGuard from other people. But here is the crux of our conversation today. Actually, let me just move my face. I really did not design my slides well for my face. I want to talk about tunnels, and there's two types of SSH tunnels. Now, they have multiple names, which annoys the crud out of me. You've probably heard of forward and reverse SSH tunnels, and I think that is just the worst name for SSH tunnels ever, because it is so unclear and makes a very confusing concept even more confusing. So I will always refer to them as local and remote tunnels. Hold on a second. Pardon me. Okay. So local and remote tunnels, and it works out better anyway, because the flags for local and remote tunnels are -L and -R. So local and remote is where it's at. Okay. How this works is you can basically, when you have an SSH connection established, right? So we have this connection between the client and the server, and this entire white bridge, so to speak, here is our SSH connection. Once that's established, we can send stuff back and forth through that tunnel. In fact, not even to each other, but like to other things on the network side that, on the client side or the server side. We can reroute traffic through these tunnels. And this is an extremely flexible and very useful, and in some ways dangerous and creepy, especially when we talk about remote tunnels, which I'll talk about in a couple slides from now. But the big thing that you need to remember, let me make sure I didn't miss anything on my notes when I'm talking about tunnels. The local and remote. And the reason that I like calling them local and remote is you define the tunnels by which end of the tunnel you connect to. So if we set up a local tunnel, we're going to connect to our local computer. If we set up a remote tunnel, the connection is going to be available on the remote side of the tunnel. So it always refers to where you connect to the tunnel. This is, again, outside of our SSH connection, right? Our SSH connection is established. We're not talking about that. We're talking about the tunnels that we set up inside of SSH, and the tunnels are defined by where you connect to it. I know I've said that 13 times now, but I hope that if you get nothing else from this entire talk, is that SSH tunnels are defined by where you connect to them. All right. So first, let's talk about local tunnels, because they are the easier of the two to understand. I'll get rid of myself here. And so how a local tunnel works is, I'll try to do a good job of, and I actually stole these slides from my YouTube video. So if you watch my YouTube video and say, hey, that's on YouTube. Yeah, it is. I made them. Doggone it. I can do what I want. Anyway, so we're going to say that our SSH connection starts from the workstation. It goes through the internet to the SSH public port that the remote server has like exposed. Like usually a port forward from the router goes into a local computer, and that's usually the way that we connect to a remote server, right? So we're connecting over the internet through the SSH port, and we've set up this SSH connection. Now, inside the tunnel, we can set up a local, so it's going to be a local tunnel, which means that we connect from which side? This side, right? We're going to connect from our local side, and we say what port we're going to connect to on this local side. So I'm going to say, let's say 8888 is the port that we're going to connect to on the local side of this tunnel. Okay. And we're going to connect or tie that local port 8888 to, wow, this is a very thin tunnel that I made here. We're going to connect it to this local web server on the remote server. Happens to be running on localhost only, meaning it's not listening on any external IP addresses on this remote server. It's only listening on 127.0.0.1. And this is the sort of thing where a lot of times when you install an application, it will only listen on localhost. This is a scenario that you could use SSH in order to connect to it, even though if you're not sitting at the console of this remote server. Anyway, we tie that to this localhost port 80. And how the local tunnel works, this is where the magic happens. When you are here on this workstation, you just connect to port 8888 on localhost, select localhost, port 8888 on your local workstation. And what replies when you connect to 8888? Why, this web server over here, its port 80 is connected to this port. So you have made it so that you're connecting to something that's only listening on localhost on a remote server. And now you can connect to it on your own computer on a port that you have established. And so local tunnels are so cool. The most common way that I use this, I'm going to put my face right back in there so you can stare at me while I talk. Oh, look, I could have put myself right there the whole time. I made this nice bump and everything. This is extremely useful. It doesn't have to be across the internet. This is the sort of thing that I usually use internally, like in my house. If I install, I'm trying to think of an app that only listens on localhost, and it's escaping me. I'm going to blame COVID, whatever. A lot of times you'll install an app though, and it will only be listening on localhost on the server, and you have to log in to configure it to listen on, the other interfaces. Sync thing. Okay. Thank you, John. I appreciate that comment because we're better when we're a group, right? Sync thing. So yeah, it'll listen on 127.0.0.1. And if you're running it on a server, which often we do, right? At least we have one of our sync thing nodes running on a server, you can't connect to it because it's running and it's only listening on localhost. So all you have to do is set up a local tunnel, SSH into that server, and then you connect to your own computer on port 8888, and boom, you are connected to the sync thing that is actually running on localhost only on the remote server. It's just the coolest thing ever. And you find yourself doing it a lot, like a shocking amount of times. I will set up a local port like this. Another thing that I use this for, I know that I talked about using a SOCKS proxy or shuttle, but before I had site-to-site VPN, so I live here in Petoskey. I'm in my house with apparently crappy internet that disconnected me, but I have a farm in Brutus, if you're familiar with Northern Michigan. And the cool thing about my farm in Brutus is up north here, the Great Lakes Energy recently started TrueStream, which is fiber internet available for rural areas. And even though my farm is out in the middle of nowhere and it used to have no ISPs available, right now at my farm, I have commercial grade full gigabit fiber right to my farm. And so I set up a data center there. And the things that I would do before I set up a site-to-site VPN was I would SSH in, and then I would set up a tunnel so that I could like configure Proxmox, like the internal Proxmox server. I would like forward port 8006 to my local 8006, and I would connect to localhost, and that would allow me to configure the server remotely, even though I didn't have VPN set up. Oh yeah, I know. The fiber is, and it's like good too. It's like shockingly good. I was able to upgrade to commercial grade, which just, they don't limit it if it's congested and, you know, static IPs. I was able to do reverse DNS so I can host my own email. Anyway, yeah, it's pretty cool. I would love to move out to the farm. My wife, not so thrilled. We live downtown Petoskey, which is a great place to live, but someday maybe I'll convince her. Anyway, local tunnels, super, super useful, right? The next one is a little bit more complicated, a little bit tougher to wrap your head around. But remember, the one thing that I hope you learn from today, if you didn't already understand it fully and completely, is that the tunnel is named by where you connect to it. So we just described a local tunnel here. Our next slide is a remote tunnel, okay? So I'm going to go slow, and I'll probably repeat myself a bunch of times, but this is a tough concept. So if you're like, what the crap, watch the video where I stole these slides from, because again, in post-edit, I can edit out a lot of my ums and side bunny trails about fiber at my farm. Anyway, so the same thing is going to happen. We're going to establish a connection from our workstation through the internet to our SSH port on the remote server, right? This is, again, either forwarded through the firewall, or it better be forwarded through the firewall. You should not have a remote server directly connected to the internet. That's just poor practice, so don't do that. So anyway, we're connected with this SSH forward into our remote server. And now we're going to establish a tunnel, but this time, the tunnel is going to be listening on the remote server. Okay, so we're going to, and I actually drew a box here, whereas last time I had to draw it in. So what we're doing is here, we are saying, okay, on port 2222, I want you to listen for incoming connections on this remote server on port 2222, and I want it to connect to a server inside here. Like my workstation is running SSH, but there's no port forwards. I want you to connect port 2222 on the remote server through the tunnel, which is still pretty skinny, through the tunnel to this computer's SSH port, which means that you can now connect to remote server, its IP address, port 2222, and establish an SSH connection to my workstation where I initiated this. Now I'm gonna go full screen Shawn here, because this is creepy. Okay, I worked at a different data center, a different job ago. It was also crypto related. I don't know what is up with me. I'm just not anyway. It was a full data center. It had like thousands of Bitcoin miners inside, but the owner was very specific about I could not forward any ports from the router into the network. He was concerned about security, and no logical talk from me about what I would do with those forwarded ports would make a difference. He just said no, and I didn't have control of the router, so I couldn't do it no matter what. So basically, no incoming ports into the data center, but I needed to get in there, and there was no VPN set up either. So what I did is, in a real creepy way, I had a computer inside. I was physically there, and I set up an outgoing SSH tunnel. It was a remote tunnel. I set it to go out to, actually it was my house where I had a static IP at the time. I established a connection with a remote tunnel, and then at my house, I exposed, it was literally port 2222, which I know I'm giving away all my secrets now. But if I connected to my home's IP address on port 2222, I could actually connect inside the data center to that SSH server that I had set up inside. And I just used, a startup script that would keep SSH running. And there's other tools that you can do that, which escape me right now. I don't remember the tools that will just keep it running, but it just basically kept the SSH connection running. It would send keep alive packets, and it was always available for me to connect, even though there were no incoming ports at all. So anyway, that was creepy. Whether it was, I don't know. I had to do it because he wanted me to be able to maintain the server. So anyway, whatever you think about that, it's possible to do that. Now, there are some encouraging things. Let me see if I had notes here. Yeah, it's sneaky, but there are some safeguards in place. For example, by default, let me change pen colors. There's too much white here. You can't, by default, SSH server running over on the remote server, like I'm connecting to that SSH server, the default configuration will not allow you to expose ports on anything other than the server's 127.0.0.1. And so without changing the config, it's not possible to expose port 2222 to the rest of the network or, the rest of the internet or whatever. So you have to make a change on your SSH server. It's just a change to the SSHD config file. So it's not like a major change. You have to recompile, but just by default, you can't, it's called gateway ports, I think is the setting, but you have to change that in order to do that. But that is what that's what a remote tunnel can do for you. And when you have SSH, I'm almost done. I promise. I'm sorry if anybody's asleep. You can just click on that nap thing in the message, and I got to get rid of my face here. But I lost my train of thought. I guess it's good that I'm almost done. Anyway, yeah, it's completely gone. But anyway, so when you set up these tunnels, the local, which, like I said, -L, capital L for local, capital R for remote, you give it the local and remote IP and port in this format. First of all, local IP or remote IP, this very first, I don't know what we call this, the very first section, these are little sections in the definition of the tunnel. The very first one is assumed to be 127.0.0.1. So if you don't put an IP address and a colon, you can just leave this off. You'll often see people specify tunnels where it starts with a port, colon, the remote IP, colon, the remote port. That just means that they left this off, and it's just going to be listening on the local computer's 127.0.0.1. The reverse is the exact same way. If you don't specify a remote IP address like 0.0.0.0, which means all of my interfaces, if you don't specify that and you just leave this part off and you say remote port, local IP, local port, it's going to assume that you're only listening on the remote 127.0.0.1. And again, unless you make a change, you can't change this to anything other than localhost anyway. But the order is what's important here. So let me get rid of all my scribbles. I am a scribbler. So if you do watch my YouTube videos, be prepared for a lot of scribbling because I'm just a scribbling dude. But the important thing is that when you set up a tunnel, whether it's local or remote, the first section is what you access, like the stuff that you're accessing. So again, it's a local tunnel. So it's the local computer, but the local IP address and the local port. And then the second half is what you get, like what it connects to on the other end. And it's going to be remote IP and remote port in the case of a local tunnel. And for a remote tunnel, the thing that you access is going to be the remote IP and the remote port, and then the local IP and the local port. I hope that makes sense. I know this is like the absolute toughest part of all the tunneling is understanding remote and local tunnels and how you set them up and what all this crazy colon and port and IP stuff means. But it's so worth it, and it really isn't a shameless plug when I say to check out my YouTube stuff on it because I really go into depth, and it is a live demo over there, et cetera, et cetera. And so here, I'm going to put my face on the screen, but I'll leave the screen up so you can write these things. I'll put my face right on Jupyter. I'm down here now. Anyway, it kind of went off the screen here too. Me and my poorly framed slides. Anyway, if you have questions or rants or dad jokes, please, Craig, I think you're the official moderator, so you can moderate or just ask me questions. But the SSH course is here. Just this is my short URL. Snarco is not, some weird URL that I'm going to steal your credentials. But snar.co/SSH is the course that I did on SSH stuff. There's only 3 videos. And my whole YouTube channel is youtube.com/Shawn Powers with a 0 for the O. And I finished a Linux Essentials course, like a complete course. And people have taken the exam and passed after watching my course. So I'm excited about that. And this week we're starting Linux Plus. The CompTIA Linux Plus exam was actually revved today. It's a brand new version of the exam today. And so this week I'm starting a full Linux Plus course that if you're not familiar with Linux Plus, after CompTIA split off from LPI and LPIC 1, it's now a single exam. It's very thorough. It's one of my favorite exams and certifications. Even if you don't want to get the cert, the content itself is very thorough, very robust, and worth learning. And we're going to learn that all on the YouTube channel over the next several months. It's a huge course, so it's going to take me a while. But anyway, that's that. So please ask me questions, and I will do my best to answer them.
So we have one question. What did you use for the screen annotation software? Is it OBS?
Okay, so do you remember at the very beginning of our conversation here, I said that I'm using Windows for reasons that are frustrating?
Aha.
The reason that it's frustrating is because I cannot figure a way to get any presentation software, LibreOffice, even like Microsoft Office on OS 10, I can't figure out any way to quickly switch my annotation pen to different colors. But there's a Windows open source program called Auto Hotkey. And with Auto Hotkey, you can just do hotkeys to switch colors. And so on my Stream Deck that is right here in front of me, I just have buttons. I can do green, and I can do pink, and I can do blue or black apparently, and white, and I can switch while I'm presenting. Oh, that's behind my face, but you can, they're there. They're different colors.
See little bits there.
Okay. Yeah. And so, that's why that is the reason that I'm using Windows right now on this computer, because OBS is available for Linux and it works great. But that's the one reason, is because I can't figure out a way to change pen colors quickly on any other platform. So
if anyone out there is listening and finds a niche of something that they would like to program, this would be it right there.
Yeah, because Epic Pen, works for Windows and probably OS 10 too. There is probably a tool for annotating on a screen with Linux. And if there's a way to switch colors with a hotkey, let me know. That'd be just really cool, because that is why I'm using it.
Wolf has a recommendation for Keyboard Maestro on Mac. Might have an answer for that, but
okay, maybe. Oh, there's literally no way to tell PowerPoint or any of the OS 10 presentation softwares to switch pen colors. It's the craziest thing. And, I could do this. So this is possible if you just go to the bottom of the screen, which, you can see it. And then, I can pick a color and change it. But I really just want to be able to do it with a hotkey so that while I'm presenting, I don't have to pop up this thing on the bottom and all that stuff. Anyway, that's, sorry to be so,
no, that's all right. That's
Linuxy, but that's why I'm on Windows.
It happens, honestly. One of our friends, Michael Lucas, talks about his publishing pipeline, and basically there are certain publishers out there that unless you use Microsoft Word and conform to the bugs of Microsoft Word, they will reject your stuff. Yeah, which is very frustrating. Are there any other questions out there? Especially if you're on YouTube as well, you can also ask the question. We'll be more than happy to send it along. Or if you want to raise your hand, you can do that as well if you'd like to speak, or just unmute yourself.
Yeah. So, managing your keys. Could you go over maybe some cheats or easy ways to manage a lot of keys with SSH?
So there are tools like what is it? Somebody here is going to know much better than me, but is it HashiCorp? Is that the place that does like robust enterprise key management stuff?
That's a good question. I don't know offhand. I can do a quick search and see if that's
okay. I'm pretty sure it's HashiCorp, like a real company, but that's the only real like enterprise grade tool that I'm familiar with, and by familiar I mean exists and is used by company. There are ways that you can manage your passwords using, or I'm sorry, not your password. Well, you should manage your passwords using what I'm going to say in a second too. But just a lot of password managers. Like, somebody actually, just posted in the chat talking about like 1Password. Most password managers will manage SSH keys as well. Like I use LastPass, not because I love LastPass, but because I've been using it for so long that switching is a grumbly process for me. But most of them support keys. But as far as like, if you mean like issuing and revoking and for like a group of people that you have to manage, HashiCorp is really the only company that I know of that does that. There are some other projects out there. There's some other tools out there. I mean, just as well as I could Google SSH key management, you can Google that as well. But HashiCorp's the only one that I know of that's like enterprise grade for managing large groups of people and their keys. And I just don't know of any other way. For myself, honestly, I just keep them in my password manager. I literally keep them in my password manager with the passphrase. And boy, if you're not using a password manager that works across all of your devices, your mobile device, your browsers, everything like that, you really should. Password managers are the bestest. And my other security plug for the day, nobody asked me, but make sure 2-factor auth is on everything that you can put it on. Okay, that's it.
Yeah. I use, for my own self, I use a bunch of multiple SSH keys, and I use the SSH config for managing that. One trick, put all of your stuff in a no auto folder if you're on GNOME, because GNOME will try and load every single key that you have, and it will fail miserably. And so you will run into all sorts of weirdness where your SSH key will not work because it's busily trying to load it all in. And yeah, that's a pro tip right there.
Yeah, I remember I was talking earlier, like I don't like the automated key agent stuff. It just, I mean, it doesn't work all the time. It creeps me out. I don't know what's active, what's not active. Yeah, and if my laptop gets stolen, I don't want it to have been automatically like, and all the keys are decrypted, so that's nice.
We had a presenter, Marlon from Facebook, who they were talking about because Facebook has got, about a bazillion different machines that are out there. And one of the things that they used for their management was this, I don't know if it was, off the shelf or bespoke. I think it was an actual hardware key manager that actually would generate SSH keys and revoke them on the fly. So you get, X number of minutes of access to this particular machine or whatnot, and then yank, there you go. I don't remember what exactly it was called, but I think we have a video on it.
That's interesting.
So that may be one way of handling it as well if you're having to do it at scale. Gib, go ahead.
Yeah. So back on the, managing the keys, and you mentioned 2-factor authentication. So I have like customers or clients or, people who are using my systems, and I set up the environment, set up the keys, and then I want to provide those keys to them, right? And with 2-factor authentication, a lot of it is you have to have your own device, and you have to go through this elaborate thing to create the 2-factor authentication relationship and all that stuff. And it just seems like it might be too hard for some people to go through that 2-factor authentication. And I'd really like to be able to use 2-factor authentication, but it's going to have to be really easy to do.
Yes. And I don't necessarily, I would love it if every time somebody's issued any sort of credentials or access to a system that it was, automatically 2-factor auth. But you're right, it requires a local device, and it also requires some user understanding, because I went far longer than I thought I would, and so I'm probably going to start running out of time. But one of my frustrations with two-factor auth is I used Google Authenticator for a while because it just was on my Android phone and like, sure, it works. It's already there. It's, part of the thing. And it doesn't back anything up. And I lost two-factor auth stuff for some of my very important financial places. And by design, it's extremely freaking difficult to get account access back if you don't have the ability to do two-factor authentication. And so people can get very frustrated because it does require user interaction and a little bit of user understanding. And, like I recommend Authy, not because I love the company, but because it at least allows you to sync and keep some backups that's encrypted. They don't have access to it and stuff, but the general public doesn't necessarily have the familiarity with two-factor auth stuff. A lot of times the texting two-factor auth, which is better than nothing, that can often be implemented. Almost everybody has, a phone where they can get a text, but I don't love that method of two-factor authentication because I almost had my phone number hijacked. When I worked at CBT Nuggets, they actually managed my phone account, and somebody called in, pretended to be me. I'm a public figure enough that there's a lot of my information out there. They called Verizon, and thankfully the Verizon person thought it sounded a little hinky. And so rather than giving them, changing my access over to their SIM, which is what they were trying to do, like, oh, I lost my phone, this is my SIM, can you activate it? Rather than doing that, they just disabled my account. And so my phone didn't work, and I was able to call in and get it straightened out. But that freaks me out. And so I don't like the SMS based two-factor auth, but it has the advantage of everybody has SMS in their pocket. So I don't have a great solution to that other than if you can use two-factor auth, do so.
I know on my side, I've got Pass, which I use, which is a shell based password manager. And it also has plugins. And so you can use there's one called TOTP. And I think there's another one, which is a password plugin for OTP, which I probably would have used had I not started off with TOTP initially. Mm-hmm. But that's one that you can use for not only does it support that, but you can also use a Git repo. So you can then sync through all of your various machines using Git, which is very handy.
Yeah, and again, it's of course encrypted on Git. It's not like, Microsoft has access to your stuff. Microsoft is the ones who bought GitHub, right?
Yes, they did. But I don't push it to GitHub. I'm not silly like that.
Yeah. But even if it was pushed to GitHub, it's going to be an encrypted.
Ideally, yes. It's PGP, and hopefully no one will.
Yeah. It's one of those creepy things, like, you don't want to do it anyway. But
So we have a question from Mark T. How can I support my grandma's Linux box who is behind a NAT firewall so we both can type and see her screen? Bonus of GUI and not just a terminal window.
Oh gosh, you could use something like Spice. And the thing is, behind her NAT. So what I would recommend is setting up some sort of easy to bring up VPN connection, or you can use like an ad hoc SSH thing, right? Like, okay, grandma, double click on the link that I put on your desktop, and using this would be a case of like where I would think a password-less key pair for this connection that you're going to bring up, and then use something simple like VNC or Spice or something like that to remotely connect. That's what I would do. I would want it to be not something that's always active, but something that she could activate pretty simply. And Tmux, Tmux works. Cron job to connect neural system, do something. So Dale brings up one of my not frustrations, but one of the things you have to deal with, in that if you're setting up a cron job that needs to do something over SSH, there's not a great way to do that unless you use a password or passphrase less key pair. And if you do that, if you figure that the security risk is worth doing, make sure that it's like a single use thing. Don't like, oh, I'm going to use this, the same key pair that I use to connect to my bank. Nobody connects to their bank with SSH, but just think through the implications.
So for NAT and whatnot, what I would recommend is if you do open up SSH or something like that, at the very least, make it so that no passwords can be used. That's a big one. is to make sure that you don't use any passwords. The second thing is put it on a different port other than 2222 or other than 22, because
other than my 2222 as well. Now that
mine's on 2222. So have fun with that. Anyways, at the very least, you get rid of a lot of spam that comes along, because everyone on the planet is literally poking at those ports and that. So you're going to get a whole bunch of stuff. I recommend SSH guard as well. That's a really fun one, as opposed to setting up fail-to-ban, which can be kind of weird. SSH guard is pretty, single purpose. Okay. And what it will do is if it detects any kind of activity that it determines is an attack, it'll put them in timeout for a bit. And I've had things where people are literally timing themselves out for about a day or so before they tire themselves out. Wow. It's real fun.
Yeah. One other thing too, about like the grandma's Linux box. I reckon that would be one of those situations. I wouldn't port forward anything from her like router in. I would have her establish an outgoing connection. Yeah. And like that would be a perfect use case for a remote tunnel, right? She starts it from inside on her laptop or whatever, and to something that you can specify, and it opens a remote tunnel that you can then connect to, to get into her stuff. That would be my recommendation there too. Because open ports on other people's stuff is just bad anyway.
Yeah. Any other questions out there? Dad joke. How did the computer get drunk? It takes screenshots. Very cool.
Nice.
Little Fluffy mentions, I haven't tried using it yet, but KeyPass XC can be used for TOTP two-factor authentication, although they advise saving the password and the TOTP token in a separate database. That's just good thinking. But yeah.
Oh, and since we're talking briefly about password managers, I hate the idea of writing down passwords. Like, it causes me physical pain to see a password written down. And I have a complex password story where I forced complex passwords at the school district, and I went into the central office, and every one of the secretaries had their complex password as a sticky note on the monitor, and it just, part of me died. But anyway, the two passwords that you should write down, physically write down and keep in a safe, are your password manager master password and the password to your two-factor auth app, like Authy. Those should be written down, because if you keep your Authy password in your password manager and you can't log into your password manager because you don't have your Authy, you need two separate passwords written down and stored somewhere safe, ideally in a literal safe. So
either that, or you get to use all your backup codes, which I'm sure you have printed out. I'm definitely sure.
And of course, my backup codes are all in my password manager. So
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Are there any other questions out there?
Not question. Thank you for making it simple. I like the pictures, the drawings. I like the fact that you started off saying SSH is for connecting to a remote computer and not assuming that everyone knows that. Oh. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And by the way, thank you.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you very much.
That was fantastic. Thank you.
Right,
if there are no other questions, then have you used IPv6 SSH? That's a great question.
So I have accidentally. I'm just, my presentation is gone, but I'm just on a regular screen now. I think I have accidentally, because I think it'll default. Like, I tried to connect to something and IPv4 wasn't set up right. And then all of a sudden I connected anyway. And I'm like, what the heck? And it was internal. So apparently I had IPv6 DHCP set up inside my network, and I didn't even know it at the time. And I was really angry that I was able to connect when I shouldn't have. So it took me a while to figure out how on earth that was working when it shouldn't have. So yeah, not on purpose.
Okay, we have one other question. How often should passwords be changed? Often enough. Although honestly, if you're using strong enough passwords in that, I don't know. Password hygiene is a very complicated topic, unfortunately.
It is, and I have opinions on everything. Apparently, I think that more important than rotating or changing passwords are.
Oh no.
Hmm.
Right at the moment where it was getting good. Of course.
Strong opinion on.
Yeah. Honestly, I've been in certain situations, especially my previous job, where they would change the passwords about every 3 months, and that to me felt excessive, especially since the password management system did not actually accept any passwords that I could physically generate.
Yeah.
They change them once a year now. That's good. Because it was kind of a pain in the butt, unfortunately.
Yeah.
I literally had to create a Python script, and every time it failed, and so I had to send over to IT and say, "Please change my password and send me the password." That would be helpful. But it depends, honestly. I mean, if it's your bank password, you probably want to change it more often than not. If it's something that's not necessarily that that critical or something like that, generate your 16-character password and be okay with it. Or at the very least, go through your passwords and see which ones are 8 characters or less and say, yeah, I need to change that sooner than later. Yeah.
My default is I always generate 20-character passwords, and I don't know any of them anymore.
Yeah, exactly. They're all in my password manager. I mean, I should not know what my password is. But unacceptable characters
don't reuse
is
passwords.
Awful.
He's back.
So the logo on my shirt is my comic. I draw a comic, mybigroundworld.com, and that is spot.
Did we just lose him again?
I wish he was at his farm, because I think his connection would probably be much better than it is right now.
Oh, there he is.
Back? Am I back again?
Yeah.
Again.
Man, I don't know what the deal is. So Spot is it's from my comic, mybigroundworld.com.
Oh, that's cool.
And there's plushies, and I actually felt like I didn't realize that I was wearing this shirt for the thing, like hey, my comic, and then I took a drink of tea and I was like, oh my, I'm like, what is
you're like promoting, promoting is good though.
So if you look back at the whole thing, whenever I take a drink, I was holding it this way because I felt kind of bad about
look at that.
No, self-promote by all means,
Well, go to my YouTube channel and encourage me as I start the whole Linux Plus course, because it's going to be long and arduous. I created a course for CBT Nuggets when I was working there, and it was one of my favorite courses to do. But I'm excited to give the same but updated content away on YouTube. So
Little Fluff mentions, from password expiration coming up at work, the guy that wrote the memo advising complex passwords that regularly change now advises a current NIST document a password you can remember and change only if you have a reason to do so.
Nice.
Generally speaking, I know Google has a password manager on that, and every now and again it'll go through and find all the compromised passwords, and it's always fun when you find one that has been compromised, especially for a site that you no longer go to, which is always fun.